and there's no sound.
I haven't signed in yet. It's now
Oh,
live.
it says we're live.
Live now. Can you hear me?
Hey, okay.
Hello? All right. I was having a little trouble signing in, but that's because we're using the same account. Um, the same login. All righty. Let's see. Let's get down to it, as they say.
You're missing the share.
Yep. Still doing it.
Oh,
Yeah. Okie dokie. Ah, come on. Damn it. Oh, good. Damn it. Sorry. I guess I'll just leave it here for the moment. All righty. Welcome to Wednesday office hours. Um, I'm gonna still try. Let me see if I can do this. Oh no, there it is. Okay. All right. I think I got this all set now. Oh, welcome to Wednesday office hours. And we're continuing on with what you could call a kind of triangulation around Peirce, Charles Sanders Peirce, and De Saussure and Marx. But what can mediate that perhaps is Ferruccio Rossilandi uh, and his approach to semiotics, where he's talking about um, making signs, doing signs, um, um, speaking in a linguistic way, uh, is also work. That is a language as production, as we produce language. We receive language, and in fact, we only know language because it is both produced and consumed. If you apply this sort of homology, which is what Rossilandi talks about between language and economics, it's not such a big jump. In fact, it's hardly a jump at all because we know that uh, whether we are or we aren't, whether we're disabled, for example, if you are, deaf or have an impairment or you're old and you require, closed caption, etc. All of these are distributional things. That is, you produce something, a sign, whether it's textual or nonverbal or uh, or verbal, that pretty much covers it. The uh, the business is that you're producing language and you're sitting in a productive and consumptive, as it were, a communication situation. And without lapsing into a different lecture, that's what's important about the Rossilandi component. And I added if you haven't been paying attention, um, an article trying to explain Rossi Landi. It was written in 2006, so it really is trying to update uh, Rossi Landi's contributions, and I added that at the end, and you can sort of see, yes, it's got diagrams too, uh, and you can see that it can look a little on the complicated side. Um, so you can see here in the right column, production modes of production, productional conflict, social practice, past history, exchange, size system, conflict, social reproduction, instrumental aspect, contemporary history, consumption, ideological institutions, scientific research, which is what Peirce is about, Charles Sanders Peirce, history and future history. And yes, future history. No, this is not Buckaroo Banzai, but it really has the same kind of dimensional element. Let's put it that way. So this has got, this is one way you could describe everything. You reduce everything to a kind of diagrammatic, sort of ideographic uh, uh, configuration, and it appears too complicated. And it is kind of complicated. Recall that these it's not the diagram itself. The diagram, it's like the map is not the territory. The point is to think dimensionally about how the world uh, and people in the world, that is, people in nature, are ecologically connected, and uh, a significant part of post-war structuralism is meant to try and deal with that. Whether it's Claude Levi-Strauss talking about the transformational difference between the raw and the cooked, um, we're still talking all about the same things: the relationship of culture to, and human culture, to think of it, quote unquote, as a science, which is the whole structuralist goal. Now, I'm not a card carrying structuralist, even though, I spent a little bit of time trying to integrate that into what I was doing. Um, I like to think that I was a little ahead of the game, but so far ahead that uh, uh, I didn't, have the means by which to sort of fully integrate those matters. So anyway, this is a an article on Rossi Landi, and you can see it's got lots of triangles and X and things. Um, Now, when you get down to, this is still talking about Rossi Landi. Um, I'll just read through this quickly because I think you want to. I was just talking about production and consumption. External material production, which, although it uses signs, produces not signs but bodies. This is an important distinction that's made in the later Rossi Landi work. It's that, you know, and this includes all the kind of Foucauldian stuff, that it, and yes, you could integrate it with Soren Mao's work, and talk about, from a Marxian point of view, it signs are there, but ultimately it's still about bodies, and of course our material bodies, and that we can ultimately, that's the limiting factor, right? That at some moment the body's going to give out. Anyway, number two is exchange, which is always and at the same time and constitutively. And constitutiveness was important and popular at the turn of the century, that is 2000, the 20th century and the 21st century, um, which is only constitutive relations you can trace on the anthropological and sociological side to Goffman's work. But I would assert, having suffered for a couple of years under Goffmania, that it's more than that. Constitutiveness is only one way of talking about one aspect of a much larger communication problem. But anyway, so exchange, number two, it has external material exchange, that is the process of exchanging not signs but bodies. And sign exchange, so there's external material and you might say internal material. That is sign exchange, that is communication, including as such within it. And then we get to the semiotic point. Sign production, signed exchange in the strict sense, and sign consumption. So Department 1 and Department 2, right? Volume 3, and Marx, all that's there. It's all there. It's not so complicated. It's fairly simple. Now, of course, the variations on this are pursued by people like Fuchs, etc., who, on the one hand, don't wish to move into the semiotic direction because it's complicated, and some people find it just reifies the whole issue, and it's anti-Marxist, or it's non-Marxist, or it's anti-imperial, or whatever. That you don't need to go there. The point is that you can configure it this way. Marx actually thought of it that way. Not that he was talking about signs, although Marx does, as I've said before, and as others have pointed out, as we've looked at this kind of literature. Signs happen, and Marx talks about signs. So we don't need to go there too far. The point is that we could get into a whole historiographic thing and say, well, we got to track down the sign. When did Marx say sign? Did he really mean sign? Blah, 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 blah. So let's not go there. Or you can go there. I'm just not going to go there for the moment. And number 3, external material consumption, which, even when it uses signs, consumes not signs, but bodies. So there's a kind of material phenomenological constraint on all of this. We're going to croak, let's put it that way. And so that's a feature of the later Rossi Landi, and kind of where this particular author is going. And I appreciate the fact that she put it in this way. And yes, there's a whole thing here, and you can read that at pleasure. I'm going to go through this because we could just get crazy. Now you'll see in a familiar way in this same article, 2006, that it's got the Persian stuff, it's got the little triangle, it's got the same or the similar triangle. Let's put about the triangle, this triangular business. Rusty Landi does look at Charles Morris's semiotics, and you could argue that that's semiology and not semiotic. But anyway, the point being is that all these little triangles, triangulation and its dimensionality, as you can sort of see in the upper right here, as you can see how the triangle can unfold in space. A dialectical sign model, the difference between, as we've talked about analytic Marxism. So analytic Marxism can be seen as also having a synthetic element, and we don't need to go down that road yet, but we may have to at some moment. All right, so I've wasted a lot of time here talking about a singular article, but let me, and yes, it can get crazy. Rossi Landi's work, I'm going to try and finish up on Rossi Landi and move to the Persian side of what the issues are. Okay. One of the important elements is what we started at in the beginning, the homology between language, or a language system, and economics. And homology, of course, doesn't mean that there's an identity necessarily, but that there's a comparison we can make between material production, that is in the world, and linguistic production. Now, if you pursue it too much or too far, you wind up in the same problem with artificial intelligence. That is, that the logic, and yes, I would assert to you, and I got even the AI to agree with me, that there's a kind of abductive logic that AIs, or the LLM version of AI, does not accommodate properly or adequately, and it copped, the AI itself copped to the fact that it couldn't really do logic. Logic in the sense of an actual critical logic, and not the kind of cranking out of sort of building a big language model and get everything to associate with it and getting because it shows exactly the limitations of AI, which ultimately at some moment, once you begin to think of not only textual elements but nonverbal elements, but that's going to take a lot more work and a lot more computing time to do. And we're not there yet. We're not remotely there. Although you can see that people who have begun to fabricate things using like on the internet, in some social media platforms, artificial images, illustrations, things which violate human intellectual property issues, of course. Um, and of course deep fakes and all that other stuff. Oh, it's not quite there yet. It's getting there, and you can see how it happens in much larger context. Princess Leia is still alive. Blah blah blah. So anyway, back to the homology. There's homology between material production and linguistic production. You can see that there are articulations of it, um, and and yes, you could get real crazy about the structural elements you can see in the abbreviations. And yes, this is the same problem that we have purse, is that we have all of these sort of typological or taxonomic elements, which are interesting and have all of their own stuff. So you could build an entire art and design program around the left hand column, and on the right hand column we have in fact built entire linguistics programs around and anthropological programs around the thing on the right. So, but that's not the issue. I mean, ultimately, that's not the issue. The point is that there's a structural relation between language, that is, oral, cognitive language, and culture, and that we produce stuff and we consume stuff, and that's part of what makes us different, as we know, between us and the primates. But that barrier gets broken down too when you can get primates to do signs, to make signs, to be able to communicate in signs. Um, Not just primates, but other animals can do that. And without getting into the whole zoo semiotics thing, that's kind of where it sort of connects all this stuff, is that when you look at zoo semiotics or the larger socio-ecological kind of connections, that's kind of the important point, is that there's a continuity among these things because of nature itself, as we are part of nature, et cetera, et cetera. So a Parchegi, which is I don't know if it's her term or Rusty Landy's, but a Parchegi is a parking lot, and uh, you could say that ultimately it all boils down to parking lots, and I find that more amusing, having worked in one. Simply that a parking lot is a kind of contingent place where you put stuff, and stuff that moves around, right? But it's only contingent and it's mobile and it's got all those things in it. So using Parchegi is sort of amusing. So that this is where Parchegi appears. And then, of course, you can see that these are dialectic relations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So all in one, chart, you get homological relations. And yes, so there's much more to the homology model. The just to 10 levels is shown in the synoptic diagram in Figure 5 that brings together a graphic version of Landy's own table from 77 and 85 with a visualization of three further constituents. Number one, the five qualitative leaps, the corresponding five, yes, parking lots, Parchegi, and the four articulations. And yes, this can sound like Buddhism or something else. There's all these things, but these are multiple levels, and there are multiple. And when you have multiple levels, you have multiple relations, even in parking structures. And I just find that more amusing, only because parking lots were important for me around that time. Anyway, so yes, it is much more simplified in the Rossi Landi model. And so, it has all the elements, material, it has operations. You can see the relation to other things that we were talking about earlier, the things that make aphorismo in the Italian context more interesting is that initial analyses or applications of Peirce, of semiotics in the workplace, in the collective workplace, as it were, uh, you can see how these things can be applied. That is reorganizing, thinking about the whole question of collectivity, and nowhere in this triangle do we see. I mean, we could, professional or managerial stuff. So anyway, that's the kind of the way in which we get back to class struggle issues. So yes, and you can pursue that at your leisure. The point is that uh, where did I? Sorry. Here's a picture of Rossellini himself, the late Rossellini. Uh, so this Gloria Witham article, 2006, Ferruccio Rossellini, an overview on his ideas on social reproduction and innovation. Note that she has a particular position that she's moving in this article, and yes, it has other connections, and yes, you can push it in a different direction. I would assert that if you read, and I haven't read enough of Soren Mao's text to sort of see where this fits, but it kind of fits. And so you can leap ahead another 20 years to get to see where this still connects with the same set of activities. So there's all of that. All right. So I've unfortunately wasted an incredible amount of time doing the front end on what I wanted to do. So let's go back to the beginning. And so the point I was trying to make was, if we were thinking about Rossellini, Peirce, semiotics, and economics, we would come up against, and this is where my more recent confrontation with artificial intelligence has come in. There's a thing called not only abduction in the kidnapping sense, but abduction in the logical sense. And yes, this is part of the meaning of abduction. You'll see in um, the post-structural whatever literature, a discussion of abduction. I think Grimos talks about it, among others. Um, an abduction is a provisional explanation which might account for a surprising or unexpected event. So there's an indeterminacy built into here, and that's sort of the whole point. Is that that's the contradiction, in fact, or the antithetical component. It is that you're confronted with a world, and there are things that are, yes, random, or things that appear random. They're just arbitrary if you think semiotically. And so, and of course, even arbitrary things have contingent elements. So they're constitutive in that sense. So an abduction is a provisional explanation, so verbally, which might account for a surprising or unexpected event. Abductive logic talks at great length about this, and this is the problematic element of, to get back to artificial intelligence, of the limitations in LLM models, that they do not, or cannot, or not yet anyway, and mainly because we don't have the tech to do it. Quantum computing will probably fix that, but anyway, that's ahead of my lifetime or whatever, after me. But I think that that's kind of where we're going to head. And I would assert, of course, that there's money in it on the one hand. On the other hand, oppression is also in it. So I took this other little chart here from the analysis of Saussure. And the idea, we also have to consider the relationship of idea to sound, and then the sub idea of idea A to sound A, and idea B to sound B. So in the big picture, there's lots of ideas and lots of sounds, and you can see how this is kind of a sub problem that we're looking at as part of a much larger dimensional problem, and then you can talk about matrices and shit like that. There will also be a well-defined code linking the relations of the forms of expression, FE, with the forms of content. So FE, FC gets us to the other, the Persian triangle, which, well, we looked at that earlier. Anyway, without getting too crazy, I thought I had included this at the front end. Anyway, so integrated into this little problem here is an article that talks about Peirce, Charles Sanders Peirce. And, we go far afield in our little research project here. So, and going down a different rabbit hole, we look at the work of Weibel, who is also included in that semiotic collection that we started with, the 2020 collection, the French thing, the Etude collection that discusses these sets of relationships between semiotics and economics, and more specifically looking at Peirce and economics. And Peirce, yes, talks about economics. Now, we've always known that Peirce talks about economics. It's just that, considering what he did, it was, sort of an indulgence, perhaps. It's just a thing he did, aside from the things he did on the Coast Survey and all the other work on lighthouses and other stuff, which, shows how incredibly brilliant he was in his lifetime. And of course, to get back to my little triangulation story of a hypothetical meeting between, and it would probably take place in England, because you could have a meeting of the 18-year-old Ferdinand de Saussure with the 36-year-old Charles Sanders Peirce, and with the 56-year-old Karl Marx. So, but there was no real meeting, and nothing recorded. But you could hypothesize it and actually kind of get it all to work out. And I say this because in the year that this meeting would take place was the last year of sort of a healthy Marx before he got sick, and for the next 5 to 7 years, I had carbuncles and all that other stuff. So the point being is, getting back to Peirce, so there's a literature that compares in comparing economics with semiotics, a way in which you can talk about Charles Sanders Peirce and economics. So there you have a overlap between Peirce and economics, just as de Saussure talks about economics, and of course Marx does. So there's an intersection among this that is still useful and interesting, and the whole literature. Weibel, who writes on this, and Hoover, who writes with Weibel on this. So there's an article there that talks about the relevance of Peirce to mathematical economics, and way before it really gets too ugly and mathematical in the neoclassical sense. This is probably the moment when neoclassical starts. Jevons, Walras, stuff that Marx, as we regret, of course, or the analytic Marxists might even say, but it's just unfortunate that Marx never gets there. He does work in calculus, so you can see that he was headed there. And if he'd had an academic appointment and an army of graduate students, he probably would have, really gotten there. But anyway, that's revisionist history. So, so this is a paragraph from the discussion of a piece that Hoover and Weibel write. It's a little arcane, but the idea is that in political economy, you actually want to start talking about this, because unfortunately you have a whole line of inquiry in the Marxist context that trashes analytic Marxism, because it's too damn quantitative. It has all that algebra. It has math. It has ultimately econometrics. But anyway, that's all that stuff. And people get too crazy about it, but it's still, I think, relevant, still important, still, still need an army of graduate students, but, a reserve army of graduate students, if nothing else. And so anyway, this is a paragraph from a particular work that does make ask questions about the overlap between Peirce and the discussions of uh, his thinking about not only semiotics but economics. And remember that I was talking about the 18-year-old or the 36-year-old Peirce meeting the 56-year-old Marx. And that overlap is an interesting overlap, only possible overlap, because by the time Peirce is 36, he was at Harvard. So, and doing lots of stuff. He had published all kinds of other stuff. And so by the time he starts talking about in 1877 about economics, it and math, he's already lecturing at Harvard. So there's all that stuff going on. And so and I'm not proposing this is a zeitgeist or anything, but you can see that there's an integration of these kinds of activities with Yevons and etc. So yet throughout his career, he kept up with developments in economics and that is Peirce, used economic analysis to inform his approach, both to natural science, note this is 1877, right? And to the philosophy of science. Now, the point of his interest in here was because he wanted a gig at Carnegie Institution, Carnegie, which is now Carnegie Mellon. And so he wrote a little thing just saying, this is kind of what I want to do, and it has to do with economics. And he didn't want to go too far because people wouldn't understand him anyway. So he picked a kind of more pragmatic example. Recall that there is syntactics, semantics, and pragmatics. He had approached us from a pragmatic point of view, which is very popular at the time, and which is also a zeitgeist issue of pragmatic philosophy in the latter half of the 19th century. And you can see its overlap in the American context with American Hegelianism and Royce and a bunch of other stuff. It's all there. This is not opaque, obtuse, or revisionist. It's all there. It's all interesting stuff. Unfortunately, we run out of time in our life to push this as an important idea, but in fact, it all kind of fits together in useful ways. Now, ultimately, in the big picture, we want to see how this little construction here, I'm saying this before we get lost in the weeds, is with conceptual math and Baudieu and set theory and a whole bunch of other stuff. And it all fits, well, it's not perfect, but it does fit together. Because you could say that Rossi Landi, for example, in the 70s was asking exactly the same mathematical questions as Baudieu did, the last 20 years, and making it a math problem as opposed to, a political problem. And we know that Baudieu, he has politics too. I think, and serious radical politics. And we know this obviously because he writes about this all the time. Anyway, as long as he's still around, and he won't be around for much longer. It's unfortunate, but that happens. Let's get back to the text. In 1877, he published an advanced mathematical economic analysis of the economics of research. This is what he was proposing to Carnegie as his Carnegie application in that sense, with a detailed worked example of the optimal distribution of effort across alternative research strategies applied to gravity measurements. Now you can see this is way out there, right? In 1877. And yet, this is like, the science stuff that, physicists, work on and worry about at the latter half of the 20th century. We know this, obviously. And, we're still worried about it, dark matter and dark energy, et cetera, et cetera. So he, that is Peirce, wrote a popular, non-mathematical, but deeply informed analysis of the sugar tariff. See, we're already back to the current problems. This is the current world, is that, some people are idiots about tariffs, and some of us need to sort of think about it in ways that are more accurate as opposed to idiots. And his work on other areas is suffused with economic examples and the insights born of a deep understanding of economics. He was also a trenchant critic of the way that especially normative economics developed in the later 19th century. This is exactly the same problem for Marx or Marxists. Um, and ultimately, the break between theories of labor value or labor value theory and other matters. The current paper of Weibel and Hoover is part of a larger project on Peirce's engagement with the economics, in which we will address both his particular applications of economic analysis and the influence of economics on his philosophical thought. Now, all of this is written in the context of the history of economic thought. So, in a disciplinary way, that's kind of where this is located, or the history of political economy. It's not with necessarily current political economy issues, Anwar Sheikh or all that other stuff, uh, or the engagement with classical political economy. But that's where it's coming from anyway, because it is that historical work in the history of political economy or political economic thought that kind of drives all this forward. Now, the point is, it doesn't reduce itself, and you can think, well, it's all economism, it's deterministic, and blah blah blah. Don't get too bogged down in that, because it really is more about the larger dimensional problem, and that's why semiotics comes into this, because it forces the analysis away from thinking about, it's just about neoclassical market, blah 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 blah. No, it's much more, epiphenomenal perhaps, or ephemeral anyway, and is not the way in which Hayekians go, because they're just full of shit. But this actually gets us into a much more analytic frame and allows us to do the math that Hayekians will never either understand or use. So anyway, so I included my own little note there to my own copy of the original text. So ultimately, and I've wasted 45 minutes on this stuff. So my closing 45 minutes. And we may continue with this next week, like I promised last week that we would finish off the other thing that we were looking at, and we didn't. But you can go back and look at that, and I hope you will. It is worth thinking about. So this is an article from that same uh, 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 semiotic research collection, the French one from 2020, I guess, Commodity Messages and the Homology Between Linguistics and Economics, according to Rossi Landi. So that's the front end of this. And yes, the article is in French. So, without testing your patience or my French, I mean, I could do it, but we would be here for several days working through it. But our contribution, so this is the English part of it, and you can find that hopefully useful. Our contribution will deal with the very particular method of Ferruccio Rossi-Landi semiotics, proposing, yes, what we were looking at before in the other work, a homology between linguistic production and material production. See, we finally got back to this. That permits to show, see, even that is problematic from the French, to show the semiotic aspects of economics in the narrower sense. First, we will state, this is D'Urso, Andrea D'Urso, we will state the specificity and originality of Rossi-Landi's materialist dialectical approach. You see, it's still there. Dialectical materialism and historical materialism also there. This is not, the people who whine about lack of anti-imperialist, fervor, will see that this ultimately gets back there anyway. Then we will have to highlight his consideration of messages as commodities and of commodities as messages. Now, the point here, of course, and you can see if you read further on in the other 2006 thing, is that messages are not identical to commodities. So if you make a commodity is a sort of concept, that's different or not identical to message construction, and where that pivots is what counts as signs. So that messages have signs, but is not itself a sign. That is, message describes the the exchange, the transformation, the motion, the movement, messaging in that sense. And commodities is a way of talking in a more material way about its relation, whether as intellectual property or as money, to all these matters. So that's, of course, giving you a brief introduction to the problem. Thus, we will stress his recognition of Marx's semiotic intuition in Capital, Das Kapital, another translation problem, to analyze the sign character of the exchange value. That was just what I was talking about. Sign character of exchange value. So Department 1, Department 2, semiotics, it's not that different. In fact, merely identical, hopefully, when you can see in financial capital or financialization relations among capital, that's kind of the issue. Is the problem of sign character and exchange value. And not that I'm going to go there, and somebody else, one of the army of graduate students can do that, is to look at the 2008 financial crisis as a kind of problem of sign character and semiotic intuition, as it were. So anyway, finally, we will show some possible developments and intersections of Rossi-Landi's theories concerning recent analyses. Now, remember, this is being written in 2020 on the present phase of capitalism and the important role of the commodity messages homology, the commodity dash messages homology, the homology between commodities and messages in our epoch of communication production. So that's a long way of getting there. But I would assert to you this is a little more satisfying than going in direction of Fuchs's work, etc. I mean, not that that's irrelevant. I think Fuchs's diagrams are really important for explaining the relationship, the complex relationship in the basic Marxist equation, and blah 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 blah. So that's all still there. And in terms of information production in the European context, blah blah blah. Prima facie. So these are quotes from Rossi-Landi. Prima facie, a commodity presents itself as the simple object of an act of bartering or purchasing. See, we get right back to the anthropological. But one comes very soon to see that the simplicity of commodities is only apparent, and that a commodity functions instead as a message within a highly complicated nonverbal communicative situation. So in this one little paragraph here, we see the entire problem of commodity fetishism, economic anthropology. It's all there. It's the bridge or the break or the movement between feudalism and capitalism. It's actually an uneven development, but you can see how that you can talk about it in those ways. So another paragraph, and see, I've been doing this to spare you all of the yammering in French. To just give you a flavor for the stuff that when it gets translated, when Rossi-Landi is writing in English about stuff. This is Rossi-Landi. Analogy, remember, language analogy, right? Analogies of things. Analogy is similarity, direct similarity. You see already that's a semiotic problem. Direct similarity between objects of any sort, isolated and kept immobile, the static relation. The similarity here is traced a posteriori from a position subsequent to the artifact, according to some criterion put to work contingently. So you can see there's a contingent relationship. There's a historical material element here. It goes through time, right? The a posteriori kind of element here, etc. A priori versus a posteriori, etc. So an analogy, this is still Rossi-Landi. an analogy provisionally reunites what is divided, or at least what is united in a necessary way, superimposing upon any two objects whatsoever a third element extraneous to them. You see, we're already back to the triangle, right? Subject, object, interpreted, right? Well, it's all there. And it is just this third element that serves to bring the similarity to the fore. So the point is that it's not about the analogy of one thing to another, but rather the movement, the connection, the whatever, however you want to describe that, the leap that people make or fail to make, right? Fail to make. That's the whole semiotic problem: is people who fail to make semiotic connections. Uh, which of course sort of separates wheat from chaff ultimately. So the homology shows that what appeared, or usually appears to be divided, is actually genetically united. Now, that's maybe a step too far for some people, but anyway, the two brief formulae, that is, analogy is the superimposition of the one upon the two. See, that's what, when we make an analogy, that's what we're doing. And then homology is the recognition of the original unity. This is where it becomes structural, right? We acknowledge or recognize the original unity. That is the genetic bringing back of the two to the one. So every analogy we make is ultimately not because one thing displaces the other or substitutes for the other or is added to the other, but rather it is the movement between the two, if you're making an analogy, to be over simplistic about it. Using the analogical method means starting from two to arrive at one. The assumption is that the processes under consideration are separate at the origin. Using the homological method means instead starting from one to arrive at two. See, we're still in very simple algebraic area that where Marx was. That is recognizing the real and original process has consisted in the division of one into two. An extreme case of the analogy is isomorphism. That is this uh, where two things kind of merge, or you begin to think of them as you make very close identity comments on it. An illustrious example of isomorphism is the belief that the structures of language correspond to you see, this is where reification occurs, correspond to those of the world understood ontologically as such, subtracted from human production by definition, and then, so to say, regained by the procedure of a post-eventum comparison of the two orders of products. This whole point, not the whole point, but a point of structuralism and post-structuralism is to ask these kinds of questions. That it's not so much, making all these diagrams and shit. It is actually talking about that the diagrams help get us somewhere, a dimensional somewhere. And I think that's really important. It's really the reason why the second half of the 20th century, you just can't sort of jump over it and go back to class struggle analysis, et cetera, et cetera. Class struggle analysis has always been there. It's just simply to understand at a very basic level, and you can see this in the Aperismo type triangles, is that people talk to each other in the workplace. They communicate about these sort of things. It's like um, the piss in the Amazon bottle. These things, there's stuff going on. It's all mediated. It's problematic. It's stupid, but also, oppressive, alienating, etc. Thus, isomorphism is a dialectical halt that from the beginning stands in the way of starting any sort of homological research. So what he's, complaining about here is that, you get down and you sort of see, well, you can get all the elements to sort of correspond. And so therefore we can substitute one for the other or treat them as one, as one might say. So what this is a post-structural complaint about making these kinds of judgments, contingent judgments, is that you need to sort of break them apart again and keep breaking them apart. That's been the whole point of post-structural analysis. It's that you not only break stuff, but you put them back together and re-break it again in order to find all these kinds of connections. That's the whole point of deconstruction, I would assert. very Derridian in that sense, and rather than privileging a sort of singular or totalized thing. We could even say that it is its dialectical overturning, or at least its character, and that can get you into a whole other kind of way of approaching stuff. And we know this from looking at the deconstruction literature that it can do that. And the example that is not shown enough, and probably because he's still alive, is the interchange between John Searle, the philosopher of social ontology, and among other things, and Jacques Derrida, the late Jacques Derrida. So, and Derrida, well, anyway, that's a whole nother lecture. He makes something of a mess, that is Rusty Lundy, when talking of the signification of commodities. He collects in a single signify of the commodity as such, a single signification of the commodity as such, the significations that come to the commodity message from the level of products and from the level of mere goods. There's a difference. And instead, he puts the whole signification of the commodity, such as in a notion he has of the signifiant of the commodity. In this way, everything that is genetically gone into a commodity is flattened into the idea of a signify of the commodity, considered as a mere sign. And the message character of the commodity as such is flattened into the idea of a signifiant of that very sign. So this addresses the question that we often come up to. Well, not we often come up to, but people come up to in the issue of empty signifiers, for example. I think you could use this to describe the problems of empty signifiers. Rossi Landi again. Now, note that I'm just taking the English paragraphs as opposed to trying to, drag you through the French. But I'm trying to show that, structurally speaking, that you can actually take the English paragraphs from a French article and sort of get it to work properly. So, to put it better, rather than simply erroneous, it appears in the first place to be, this gets to the semiotic question, arbitrary. Things are arbitrary and not random. It's a thing that I talk about a lot, is that arbitrary things are not random things. And in the second place, to be seriously out of phase, this is a dimensional question, with regard to reality. And it's arbitrary because one could turn it over and move it around in various ways and then discuss uselessly and endlessly about the various operations made. And, the mental image, of course, is all those blind guys coming up to an elephant, right? That whole little story. And, God forbid the guy who winds up at the rear end of the elephant. Anyway, this distribution of the roles of signifiant and signifie would be just as gratuitous as the one made by Lefebvre. This is a commentary. This whole paragraph here is a commentary on Lefebvre, Henri Lefebvre, who's really important in terms of, both political economy, post-war political economy, the city, sociology, and so Lefebvre is a really important element in this whole conversation, none the least of which is the idea that you can talk about the production, as Lefebvre does, the production of space. You see, this all can come back together again. Lefebvre talking about the production of space, and David Harvey talking about space and spatial fix, etc. All that comes together. This is not controversial, problematic, or negating. It actually kind of all works together if you put the time in. So anyway, the most serious error, however, remains that of mistaken phasing. That is the oversimplified view of the formation of a commodity sign at a level which is already much too high. That is, at a level much more complex than the one at which the signs of the nonverbal sign system of economics begin to function. So mistaken phasing is that whole problem of, um, I know it when I see it. To quote Potter Stewart, Justice Potter Stewart. I don't know what pornography is, but I don't want to see it. And that's kind of the underlying problem that we currently have. There are idiots who don't understand or appreciate that difference, or who, because they are so mentally ill, that they kind of pursue it for their own, narcissistic reasons or whatever. Anyway, another Rusty Lundy paragraph: a commodity is not a sign; it is a message. Now, this explains what I was just mentioning, that messages are, they're not as physical, I suppose. Or you could say they're more epiphenomenal, whatever, than signs. But anyway, a message consists of complete signs, each of which is the unity of at least a signans and a signatum. This is the signifier signified issue. Um, and yes, that's just Latin. A message is built and functions within social reality. Now, it's a long slog to get to this, question, but it's an important question because ultimately it still addresses all those social ontology questions and a bunch of other things. By stressing the status of commodities as messages, and by examining the layers of meaning, remember I've talked about this layering idea, the layers of meaning that pile up within any commodity. Note, of course, that commodity is not this one thing, but it is a kind of a framework, as it were, for the message, or as a message, the message as a commodity. The danger should be avoided of viewing commodities as mere signs rather than messages. So and this sounds contradictory, of course, but the idea is that there is a subtle difference between commodities and message, and it is a semiotic one. That is, you can overindulge, that uh, uh, the image of a child being, well, no, that just gets too far into the current politics, but uh, it is that problem of, I think we'll have this underlying issue seen when we finally get, for example, the Epstein files revealed in their fullness. Anyway, or worse, as mere signatia rather than complete signs. So what we have, for example, in the Epstein matter, is that signs are incomplete, and they're incomplete in a whole variety of ways. That is, you can have congressional testimony, which just happened in Florida, where the victims themselves are talking about the issue as legalistically and as normatively and as objectively as possible. And you can have the rest of the media, which is not fully indulging the truth of the matter and comparing it with, of course, the quote unquote evidence, uh, some of which has probably been messed with, and that's a whole nother set of issues that left for a whole nother set of analyses. So, but this is still Rusty Landy. All right. Number one, a useful article, for instance, the water of a fountain has a meaning in its capacity to satisfy human need. Now, you could go to the Italian question of, that there are public fountains and that, you can, in fact, trust. I think it's Rome that has those, not that I've been there, that as public fountains, there's just fountains everywhere, spigots that, from which you can get pure water, drinking water. On the other hand, you also have in various places like Florence, etc., you have putti, uh, producing water from a fountain, which you would not normally associate with fresh water, rather with urine. So that's a whole nother question. So useful article. And then there's other possibilities, semiotic possibilities. So number two, most useful articles are human products, and products have the meaning of the human work crystallized in them. Now, this addresses the, congealment issue that we've criticized before, is that, that humans made this stuff. And the meaning of the human work, not unlike labor power, is there. It's just, you know, It's not something that you can, easily see, but you can see that it's there. It's crystallized, as it were, in them. The kind of human work to be considered here is and this is where the important element is, and that's kind of the whole analysis of 20th century plastic, for example, because of the malleability of plastic, and of course the unwillingness of people to look at the permanence or impermanence of plastic, because it really is problematic in all kinds of ways and worth a whole lecture in itself, is the specific set of operations required to produce that product as distinguished from all the other products. Because with all due respect, it is the judgment you make as a consumer when you go to the store. You try and figure out, well, okay, a machine made this thing, but how good a machine was it in terms of the things that produce plastic things, um, and the provision of material and the technology and the engineering that went into it, et cetera, et cetera. And it is, of course, the criterion that you do make if you are actually a sort of, a wide ranging consumer, the difference between plastic objects made in certain countries versus plastic things made in another country. But that's another story. Number three, we're almost to the end. I'll stop in a moment. Almost all products are commodities, and commodities have a third kind of meaning that derives from the ratio. Remember, we talked about ratios before in the classical political economic context, that there are ratios at work all the time, and that in Marx, Marx is talking less about proportion as he is talking about ratio, and without getting too far afield, the ratio of human labor allotted to them within the whole production of commodity or community, the production of a community or a system of communities. So this is the next step in terms of social reproduction and stuff. You have to think of it, or what happens at scale, uh, in that sense. Number four, we're almost done. A product can signify as a product non-verbally. This is a basic semiotic idea, like a traffic sign, or verbally, like a book. And you can see that the entire, confirmation technology, these so-called CAPTCHA items, where you either have to indulge in moving a thing to fix a puzzle or identify a thing that is difficult but not impossible to identify as a proper square, an appropriate logical square within a 16 square grid or whatever. Anyway, in this case, the commodity will convey that meaning too. In other words, there's multiple meanings there, and the machines as yet, although obviously you could design a machine that actually does it, that can break the security protocols of things meant to try to assume that, quote unquote, the person making the engagement who wants the file or whatever is a human. So anyway, without getting too cynical about that, the body of the commodity can be the bearer of additional signs concerning that commodity or something else. So the point here is that we're making a distinction between, signs on the one hand and the bodies of, commodities. So anyway, so therefore, a commodity does not go to the market by itself. It needs somebody to sell it, and it is not sold until somebody buys it. That is, accepts it in exchange for money or other commodities. In this case of in the case of barter, I am, of course, reminded of a Rick and Morty cartoon on this same issue. Anyway, a product does not conform itself into a commodity like a caterpillar into a butterfly. It undergoes such a transformation because there are people who put it into significant relations. So this is that whole point of that it requires other kinds of elements. It is not simply an engagement at a sort of mental or cognitive level. It is much more complicated than that. And when a commodity is used to satisfy a need, this means that its character as a commodity is to say, dropped, forgotten. In short, a commodity is a commodity rather than being a product or a useful article. Now, that's the whole point that Marx is making when he uses it at the front end of Capital Volume 1. It's not the thing, it's something not the thing, it's because Marx wants to get not only from objects and things that are produced and labor and all that other stuff, but he wants to go, okay, the commodity is a heuristic that you can use to sort of talk about other things. More specifically, how labor gets exploited and et cetera, et cetera. It is remarkable that Marx's analysis of commodities is crowded with references to their status as messages, which might be said to creep up from thought towards verbal expression in such clauses as, if commodities could speak, they would say, unquote. That's kind of an interesting problem. If commodities could speak, they would say. Quote, and quote, the coat, you see, we're back to the linen coats again. The coat means more than brought into a value relation with the linen than it means apart from such a relation. So we're looking at the kind of movement, historical movement, a material movement, in which, Marx is discussing the commodity in chapter 1 of volume 1. The linen, quote, the linen conveys its thoughts in the only language it knows. Now, this automatically is problematic, but, let's just follow this for a second. The language, as it were, of commodities. So anyway, I know this is just one paragraph, and it does seem a little too complicated, but the underlying deal is that, signs and commodities are not necessarily identical. They're problematized, and they're problematized in a dynamic rather than a static way. And this is a way in which, as Marx does, to say, it's not about the objects. It's about the relations among the objects. And this semiotics is important to use to work through the relations issue, the social relations issue, the relations among things and ultimately among people. So anyway, that's a long slog of trying to get to a article written in French that is on Rossi Landi, and to try and spare you kind of the underlying, conceptual issues. And in the last 15 minutes or so of my yammering here, I will begin and finally get to the Persian kind of element of our little conversation. So in this article, the triad, we saw that as a triangle, but now we see it as a Y, a junction of sign, interpretant, and object. The triadic relational value of Spurz's semiotics. And figure 2, further triads, more triads, right? So a triad implies another triad. And we saw this in other ways in which diagrammatically you can look at Peirce's stuff. And as I've said before, or at least I quote somebody else talking about, this can get really nuts, because Peirce does this. He has all these neologisms, and, people who are much smarter than I, who've looked at the papers, have said that there's 400 plus 423 signs. And that's, that's interesting, but not useful in the sense of, well, there's a finite number, but it's not true. Ultimately, and I think Peirce understands that, he's just willing to engage in a somewhat obsessive way the possibility of typologically or taxonomically approaching the problem. The front end, that is his 10 signs, is useful because you can actually see that some things, are structured in certain ways that are much more useful in terms of talking about political economy, and then in other ways, if you're talking about semiotic relations among animals or something, you could, talk about, use another set of signs to do that. So anyway, here you can see, built on that basic triad, how a sign, interpretant, and object have other things. So an object has external resistance. It's physical. You push it and it moves. It has dynamic evolutionary processes, that is chance, mechanical necessity. You do need to have things to fit together, and purpose. And then categories of objects are firstness type objects, secondness objects in the Persian context, and thirdness. And automatically, that's kind of, how serious was he about this? It's just a front end kind of problem. It's a way in which we can get to talk about the differences among things. And so, interpretant, for example, is scientific inference, which includes the word that I began this little yammering on with, abduction, deduction, and induction. Now we're more used to deduction and induction probably because we, are thinking about Sherlock Holmes or procedural crime dramas or whatever, and we don't think as much about abduction. But in fact, and I would argue that this is the case, is you can't have deduction and induction without abduction. And in fact, that's what goes on. And I would assert to you that uh, 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 movies like Clue and Murder by Death are ones that actually have all three of these things and that they work by abduction. But anyway, that's another story. Phenomenology, in this same sense, because it's all interconnected. Recall that this is not a perfect taxonomy between sign, interpret, and an object. Any object you have in the world in your engagement, anything that you engage in the world, let's put it that way, has an object part, has an interpretant part because you're dealing with it, and a sign because that's how you manage to work through it. So phenomenology is about firstness, secondness, and thirdness, and there's a lot of ink that's been spilled in the philosophical literature, because in fact that's kind of the whole problem of analysis or psychoanalysis, is to work through your delusions about firstness, secondness, and thirdness. And unfortunately, the current political situation shows us people who are insane cannot distinguish among firstness, secondness, and thirdness. But anyway, and then finally, on the upper left sign is semiosis, icon, that is the what you get, the iconographic, iconological relation between. And the easy way to do this is, of course, to talk about art. But the more complex of the way of looking at this, talk about algebra. But anyway, and yes, there's no difference. And yes, there's in fact a damn literature that, it's all those idiots who run around. Well, they're not idiots. They're very famous people who apply geometric relations to the proportions of things like uh, cathedral facades, or if you were taking this even nuttier, you look at Louis Sullivan's work and start looking at it from a geometric point of view, and then you make certain arguments which are probably not so useful, but they're interesting. Anyway, we digress. Index and symbol. So semiosis, scientific inference, phenomenology, and external resistance, all these things are at work in our simple model of, it's not so simple now, model of communication. Further triads of Peirce's semiotic conception of relation, of human relation, that is human understanding, relation, human understanding, and scientific explanation. Now you can see this broken further down in this article to try to include, and this is where the triangles get a little nuts. You can just go a little too far with your diagrammatic stuff of the different. And this is the problem or advantage of the dimensionality of legends or codes for visual things like maps, and that is, a straight black line would be efficient causality. A broken line would be a final, a dashed line would be final causality, and a dotted line would be formal causality, and a thin black line would be selection. So that's one way of doing it. You could do it a whole bunch of different ways, but you can see that the original triangle is actually dimensional, right? You can sort of see that, right? You can get a little too nuts and think of it, well, this is the M not only sits on a two-dimensional plane, but it also sits in a three-dimensional space. So you have a a three-sided triangle with an extension to P on the right. So yeah, we could go nuts with this, so let's not. So Herman Pilos, who's the other person who writes an article in that 2020 collection on semiotics about, trying to deal with this issue, and Herman Piloth goes in a whole different direction, which is important to note than a bunch of other people, um, about how semiosis. You have semiotics and you have semiosis, which describes the phenomenon itself. Now that automatically that's reifying it and being stupid about it to say semiosis, and you could commodify it too. You could sell it on info commercials and other stupid things, but that's not the point. Point is that there's a thing, and you need to sort of a motion, a movement, an action, activity that needs to be sort of dealt with. And so, of course, the point of this of looking at Herman Pilas's work is to say that it's conjoined with the original, and this is kind of historiography at work, is Peirce's Lectures on Pragmatism has a three-sided polygon, and yes, he was talking about it in 1903. At the same time, he's talking about crazy crap like insurance and marginal utility and other stuff, which is sort of the point of my entire yammering today, is that the comparison between Marx, analytic Marxism, and utility analysis, that is, the underpinnings, marginal analysis, which is the underpinnings of neoclassical economics, all sort of still there, which, with all due respect, is the way in which you sort of connect and rationalize, however you want to do it, the connection between analytic Marxism and Marxism itself, or, with all due respect, to form ultimately a synthetic Marxism. But anyway, that's another story. So Weibel's work, there's a long way to get there. Weibel's an economist and writes really interesting stuff, and is, I probably should have studied with him. C.S. Peirce's semiotic and mathematical conception of economics. See, this is that whole point that we started this whole business with, and looking at the collection of from 2020 or whatever, from 2022, from about semiotic stuff that kind of compared with economic stuff. And yes, there's a journal for it, which a whole nother set of issues. But anyway, so here's the article abstract, because I know I'm going to have to stop in a couple of minutes. And so as I close, I will begin with the front end of what maybe we'll talk about it. I may not talk about it because it really gets you into the weeds with Peirce and studies of Peirce. But the advantage, of course, of Peirce is that he left a lot of stuff behind. There are papers of Peirce. There's all that 400 plus semiotic sign system stuff, amidst all his other stuff, which is really interesting as well, and worth, send your army of graduate students out to deal with. Anyway, C.S. Peirce had a keen interest in the most mathematical economics of his era, which is actually the same mathematical economics we're dealing with now. But anyway, that's another story. We know that Peirce read and wrote about the mathematical economics of Cournot. And this is important, and because Cournot is kind of the foundational thing, and Jevons for neoclassical economics, and at least mentions the names of Ricardo, Marshall, and Walras. Peirce also provided a mathematical optimizing, that's the key word here, optimizing model of the insurance firm. Yes, it's as banal and mundane as that, but he does that in order to make a point to his audience, that is the Harvard Lectures of 1903, as its most elaborate example of pragmatism. Well, it's a lot more elaborate than that, and it is mathematical, but he doesn't go there, in terms of the lecture itself, but in, what he left behind. What is significant is that Peirce chose economic examples to illustrate what is really a semiotic and mathematical conception of pragmatism. Note that we're talking about pragmatism here, not as the big philosophic thing, but as one part of in linguistics, and this is where we get to Saussure, is syntactic, semantic, and pragmatic parts of language. Um, and yes, ultimately, it does get us back to ontological elements and social ontology and blah blah blah. Diagrams and semiotics play a central role in Peirce's philosophy of mathematics. Just a few years ago, this is where Carsten Hermann Piloth comes in, and this is a whole body of literature that I may actually write a little note. And as long as he's still alive, Sam Bowles, because he's written stuff on this too, and I just want to ask him a question about whether he has read or didn't read or has trashed or whatever. Carsten Hermann Piloth's work, Samuel Bowles' interest in evolutionary economics. Anyway, Carsten Hermann Piloth authored a long treatise. This is pretty recently, 2013 or whatever, on evolutionary economics. And Hermann Piloth's still around, so a little younger. So I mean, he's worth dealing with in this, with Peirce's semiotics as a central aspect of the work. Additionally, Hermann Piloth makes significant use of, yes, diagrams and equations from various scientific disciplines. Now, various scientific disciplines means that when we talked about this whole business at the front end, you know, in the middle period of talking about semiotics, or in the post-war period, and in the middle of the post-war period, there wasn't a lot of mathematical semiotic literature. Now there is, or there's more anyway, and so that's kind of where we're headed here. But it's not anything new. It's just simply, sort of dredging up the fact that the people who are more pivotal, the classical semioticians, as it were, Peirce, is no different than the classical political economist Ricardo Smith et al. So this is not a big problem. It's not revisionist. It is simply going, oh, okay, this is kind of where it all fits together. And yes, we can blame ourselves for Marx didn't finish all his calculus stuff, and I think Engels didn't know any math, as far as I can tell. But whatever. Anyway, Hermann Piloth makes significant use of diagrams and equations from various scientific disciplines. Diagrams are a central feature of Hermann Piloth's treatise, giving it something of a Peircean, qualitative mathematical character. So this is kind of, and qualitative here is, in quotes or whatever. These similarities and differences between Peirce and Hermann Piloth on semiotics, economics, mathematics, and evolutionary processes are quite novel and thus of intrinsic interest. So this is an article by Weibel comparing Peirce and Hermann Piloth. And the reason to do that is to connect Peirce with this whole evolutionary economics stuff. Now, without going into a huge lecture on this evolutionary economics thing, this is problematic for all kinds of other reasons. But the interesting thing, of course, that it gets us back to ecology. Ultimately, the same ecology that Bellamy Foster is looking at, I would assert, even the same one that Jason Moore is talking about, and so it's of a piece, if you want to really sort of indulge the problem, about evolutionary processes. But there's also an entire subliterature, like in evolutionary game theory, etc., where this also fits. And I refer you to Sam Bowles' work on evolutionary stuff. Anyway, so let me just conclude with the goal of Weibel's article is to bring Peirce's interest in semiotics, the semiotic approach to mathematics more specifically, and his interest in mathematical economics together for what may be the very first time. Well, I don't want to burst his bubble, but there are people who have been doing this before. Peirce read and wrote about the mathematical contributions of prominent economists in the history of economics, such as Cournot and Jevons, and he at least mentions Ricardo, Marshall, and Volra. Now, the point, of course, here is that heterodox economics of the post-Keynesian sort considers itself a not exactly in that realm. The Ricardo, Marshall, and Walras represent, as was Cornell and Evans, the orthodox, as opposed to heterodox, version of political economy. So already, when you start going down this path, you go, oh, it's all that stuff that we spend all our time fighting about, at least in economics, or we don't spend our time fighting about it. You can see the difference between, American economics and economics in, actual countries, as that contrast between the orthodox and the heterodox. Anyway, I've gone on too far and I got to stop. So, I put in the chat the linkage to this little collection of stuff I'm yammering about, and I hope you find it interesting. And hopefully, my little yammering here has induced you to think about a little bit more seriously about the connections among these elements relative to thinking about Marxism and Marx in both a analytic and a synthetic way, and to consider that underlying all these little problems here is a fundamental dialectical set of issues that is not lost in the discussion of post-war, post-structural Western Marxism. The Western Marxism that certain people will say is, evil or stupid, or you know, the subject of professional managerial, whatever, class interests, and not significantly engaged enough in class struggle and blah blah blah, or anti-imperialist stuff. Even though you can actually identify a through line through all the neocolonial and development literature and the North-South and the post-colonial and settler colonial stuff, all that is open to this kind of analysis, and in fact can be helped by this kind of methodology. So I'm making a methodological argument that does not reduce the subject or subjectivity to limited or deterministic things. So that's the kind of end of my little yakking. So I will stop. I will return us. I will stop the live stream and go back to the. Let me thank you for your attention. If you managed to get through this, and of course, the advantage of being on YouTube is that you can speed it up or whatever. Press stop.